Today I'm out here on this drizzly day in southern Washington taking a look at not one, but two different 400 horsepower crossovers. The Ford Explorer ST, this is all new for the 2020 model year, and then we have a very lightly refreshed Volvo XC90 right over here on this side. At first glance, they may not seem like natural competitors, but they both give us 400 horsepower, very similar 0 to 60 times, just 1/10 of a second difference between these two vehicles in our testing. They both seat 6 as well. An interesting bit of trivia, Volvo used to be owned by Ford, although they are no longer owned by Ford, and the XC90 is the first Volvo that they designed on their own after the Ford and Volvo breakup. It may seem crazy to be comparing these two vehicles. That Ford Explorer over there costs about $60,000 as equipped. This Volvo right here is around $80,000. This is definitely a luxury-oriented vehicle, and quite logically, this should be compared against the new Lincoln Aviator rather than the Ford Explorer. Unfortunately, Lincoln wasn't able to send us an Aviator for this particular event. We got an Explorer instead. But when you scratch the surface, the two vehicles could be an awful lot closer in price than you might think. This Volvo is a plug-in hybrid, so that means that it will get between $7,000 and about $10,000 of additional tax credits and rebates depending on the state you live in. And that could mean that a base Momentum trim XC90 T8 would be only a few $1,000s more expensive than this Ford right over here, which starts around $55,000. And with average fuel cost differences between the two vehicles of about $500, you could make up the difference in fuel costs just about within the average lease period in America, 3 to 4 years or so. Now, the Explorer, again, is going to be unquestionably more fun, but it's a little bit less refined all the way around. Under the Volvo's hood, we have everything in the kitchen sink. We have a 2-liter direct injection 4-cylinder engine. It's turbocharged, it's supercharged, and it has a plug-in hybrid system attached to it. That gives us 400 horsepower and over 470 pound-feet of torque. Under the hood of the Ford, we have a very different sort of thing going on. We have a twin-turbo 3-liter V6 engine. It's relatively new for the Ford engine, and it's mated to their 10-speed automatic transmission, sending power by default to the rear wheels. And then in the ST trim, we get one of their standard all-wheel drive systems. That's very different than what we see in the Volvo, because over here in the Volvo, we get an 8-speed automatic transmission sending power from the engine to the front wheels only. Also connected to the engine is a starter motor generator unit that generates power, ships it over to the battery that's located between the front seats, and then we have an electric motor in the back. The key thing here is that while the Ford Explorer ST can send the majority of its engine power to the rear wheels, and then it can send 50% of engine power to the front wheels when it locks the coupling, the Volvo will never be able to send that much power to the rear axle. We have about 300 horsepower just over right here on the front axle, and about 80 horsepower or so for the rear axle, and that is all the Volvo can give the rear axle. Now, because we're talking about electric motors, the rear axle in the Volvo can deliver a great deal of torque, and that leads to very different handling characteristics between these two vehicles. The Ford Explorer feels an awful lot like a BMW X5, especially the last generation BMW X5, before it got a little bit more luxury focused, a little bit softer in overall character. Meanwhile, the Volvo over here is more of a highway cruiser. It's very comfortable going quickly in a straight line, those long highway journeys, but when you get this out on a really tight winding mountain road and you're starting to drive it more aggressively, you can get both oversteer, so the rear end can kick out on you, and torque steer at the same time. The front seat design has not changed for 2020, so we still have among the most comfortable seats available in the 3-row luxury category. These front seats offer inflatable side bolsters, an available seat massage function, and an extending thigh cushion as well. But the current generation X5 has really excelled when it comes to front seat comfort. One thing that is still a little bit odd in the XC90 for this segment is that we have a manual tilt telescopic steering column rather than one of the powered memory-linked varieties that we see in some of the competitors. But the front seats, both driver and passenger, get a 3-position seat memory on the door. You can see that in the second row. If I scoot that back into place, we definitely have a little bit more legroom than we see in the Volvo XC90. And the third row in this vehicle feels a little bit more generous in terms of headroom. It's not quite as wide as the third row that we find in the Volvo, but overall headroom is definitely going to be a little bit greater. But oddly enough, we find a little bit less cargo room back here behind the third row than we find in the Volvo. Now, it doesn't look like that initially when you take a look at the numbers on paper, but that's the advantage of having both of these vehicles at the same time, is that we can see that this cargo area back here is a little bit deeper, oddly enough, than what we find in the Explorer. Even though we don't find the same kind of cubic feet back here that we find in the Ford, this ends up being a little bit more practical. Now, in a surprising touch, the Ford does give us powered third row seats, whereas over here in the Volvo, they're manual. Aside from the seating configuration, changes on the inside are fairly minor, so we have the same panoramic moonroof right there over the front and second row seats. We see the same fixed headrest designs that we've seen in Volvo for some time, and we have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver, front passenger, and the second row outboard seats. Moving over to the doors, we find a stitched leather upper section and soft touch plastics below that. We also have some different wood options available for 2020. This model uses an open pore trim in a very neutral tone. Then we have metal speaker grills right there above the memory seat controls for the driver and front passenger. The stitched leather and wood trim continue as we move on over to the dashboard. I think the XC90's interior has a clean simplicity to it. I really like the overall design in here. In the center of the dashboard, we still find the same color touchscreen infotainment system, but it now features a much faster processor than when the XC90 launched. We also have the same steering wheel design that we've seen in a lot of Volvo models out there. No paddle shifters on the back of this particular trim. I do think that's a little bit of a pity. I would like to see perhaps some regen paddles in the plug-in hybrid model. On the left side, we have the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system. And then on the right side of the steering wheel, we have track forward, backward, volume up, down, and then a button that pulls up the little menu right there in that instrument cluster. You can then interact with it using these buttons and then click OK. You would also use these buttons to interact with the adjustments for the heads-up display. Although the range has increased for 2020, the nature of the plug-in hybrid system has not changed at all. And that means that we still get a maximum of about 80 horsepower in the rear and just over 300 horsepower on the front axle. Now, horsepower isn't everything, of course. Torque accounts for an awful lot, especially in stickier situations. And that's when we can engage the all-wheel drive mode right there via that touchscreen infotainment system. And then this system will behave very differently than, say, a Lexus hybrid. Thanks to the big battery pack that's right next to me, this vehicle can balance power on the front and rear axles for an awful lot wider range than what we see in the Lexus hybrid systems, because the Lexus battery packs are quite small. That means that up to about 160 horsepower or so and well over 200 pound-feet of torque, it can put equal amounts of power on the axles. And that's going to give you much better wet weather or inclement weather performance. That's also how we get to the 400 horsepower total and over 470 pound-feet of torque combined, because the engine can be going full bore and then it can pull all the power that it needs right from that battery pack in the middle. There's definitely a toll for putting this battery pack right next to me, and the big toll is the curb weight. On the flip side, we get absolutely excellent fuel economy, but the hybrid system giveth and taketh away, because there is no mechanical connection to the rear wheels, and that means that when we floor it, we get over 300 horsepower on the front tires and a lot less back there in the rear. This is unquestionably very confident, and I really like the way this handles versus something like the Acura MDX or something like the Infiniti QX60, but it's not quite that next level that we see in, for instance, the BMW X5. This is likely going to compete very, very well against the Cadillac XT6, but the new Lincoln Aviator is going to be a little bit more like the X5 overall. Because in the past, Volvo has delivered vehicles that were a little bit more softly sprung than the Germans, but that's not happening with the XC90 now. This is definitely a firm vehicle. And of course, for 2020, we have an R-design version of the XC90 that dials things up even further, but that's on steel springs, not the adaptive air suspension we see here. If you're looking for the one with an excellent blend of power and overall fuel efficiency, that's going to be this model right here, because it's likely going to be faster 0 to 60, it's definitely going to be more powerful, and it's possible that this could still end up being more fuel efficient overall. You might be wondering why I'm making any luxury segment comparisons to the Explorer ST. The main reason is that there's nothing in the mainstream segment that is like this. The Explorer ST is finally the Mustang of crossovers. Rear-wheel drive, 400 horsepower, and even though this does have a standard all-wheel drive system, it's very clearly biased towards sending power to the rear. Those systems can send 70% of engine power to the rear under certain circumstances. But the under certain circumstances part is the key to understanding those systems, because this system could send 100% of engine power to the rear at all times if it wanted to. That's because with this all-wheel drive system, it's not possible to disconnect the rear axle, and that's really the key to the performance that we see in the Explorer ST. As you'd hope with a vehicle that has 400 horsepower on tap, traction is very, very good with this system. Ford has done an excellent job at sending power to the front when needed, but keeping the vast majority of it at the back. You can really tell as we're going around corners that they're not sending too much power to the front unless it's really needed to help aid traction. So this definitely still has a strong rear power bias to it. But really what's interesting is the immediacy of the power here. We get very little turbo lag, and all of that torque is available at very low RPMs. That's quite different than the last generation of the Explorer, even in its twin-turbo form, because its transmission couldn't handle this much power, so they did have to limit power in those lower gears. This feels an awful lot more immediate, especially off the line. A number of you over at facebook.com/AlexNautos asked me to talk about this 10-speed automatic transmission. I like it a bit more in this than in the hybrid. In the hybrid, it seemed to be a little bit disconnected at sometimes, a little bit more abrupt in the overall shifting. It's important to remember that this 10-speed auto has a ton of gears, so there's simply more shifting that's going to be going on as you accelerate, as you decelerate, as you're driving in a sporty fashion. The big thing to remember is that this transmission has more gears than the competition. So there's simply more gears that the transmission will be running through as you accelerate, as you decelerate, as you're starting to drive the vehicle a little bit harder. In addition to that, this transmission has a very aggressive lockup torque converter, so it's going to feel a little bit more like a dual clutch transmission under certain circumstances. Steering feel is obviously muted because we do have electric power steering. But because this is a rear-wheel drive vehicle and the front wheels aren't doing as much, we do get more steering feedback than we see in the Mazda CX-9. And I think that Ford is still striking a good balance between overall ride and handling ability. Now, this ST model does seem to be a little bit heavier up front than the 2.3-liter turbo. That's pretty logical since this is a heavier vehicle overall. But because this is rear-wheel drive, the transmission is right next to me. And that helps move power from the front of the vehicle to the rear, enabling better neutral handling. Bottom line, out on the road, the Explorer ST is an incredible amount of fun. This is the kind of vehicle that it would be very easy to get in trouble with because there's so much power, there's so much grip, but the laws of physics still have to be obeyed. So if you enter that corner too fast, there's nothing that's going to help you, and you'll be able to get into those corners faster than in any of the competition. Now, versus something like the Dodge Durango SRT, I think that's kind of an interesting twist. The SRT definitely has this raw and visceral quality to it. I like the 8-speed automatic transmission in it a bit more than this 10-speed automatic, but it's about $10,000 more than this. And the SRT is not really going to grip the road better than this. We haven't had a chance to directly compare the vehicles back to back, but I wouldn't be surprised if this holds the road better than that SRT. A number of you over at facebook.com/AlexNautos asked me to talk about this 10-speed automatic transmission. I like it a bit more in this than in the hybrid. In the hybrid, it seemed to be a little bit disconnected at sometimes, a little bit more abrupt in the overall shifting. The big thing to remember is that this transmission has more gears than the competition. So there's simply more gears that the transmission will be running through as you accelerate, as you decelerate, as you're starting to drive the vehicle a little bit harder. In addition to that, this transmission has a very aggressive lockup torque converter, so it's going to feel a little bit more like a dual clutch transmission under certain circumstances. You'll really notice that at lower speeds, when you're engaging first and second gear and you're driving in slow and go or stop and go traffic, this can feel a little bit herky-jerky at times because of that aggressive lockup with the torque converter. I think that most people will get used to it, and personally it didn't really bother me. But at the same time, if you dislike the way this transmission shifts in the Ranger or in the F-150, you're probably not going to like the way that it shifts in the Explorer. When it comes to overall luxury feel, without question, the Volvo is the winner here. The Ford Explorer does offer some seat massage, but it's not to the same level that we find in the Volvo. The seats are more comfortable in the Volvo, they're more adjustable, etc. The interior is definitely put together with more precision, and even though some folks have poked a little bit of fun at Volvo's infotainment system, it definitely is a lot better thought out and a lot more polished than the infotainment system that we find in the Ford. The vertical infotainment system in this vehicle just left me wanting. It feels like it needed a little bit more time to be ready, especially when you take a look at the way the camera systems interact with the Explorer. They take up a very small portion of that screen. It's not as useful as the large screen format that we find in the 360-degree camera over here in the Volvo. The Volvo is also going to be more fuel efficient. It's going to be a little bit more practical in some situations, and we have all of Volvo's latest active safety and crash avoidance systems in this vehicle, some of which we do not find on the Ford Explorer or even the Lincoln Aviator. But I have to say that if my own money were on the line at this exact moment, I would probably buy the Explorer. I don't think I'd buy this one, however. I'd probably buy the Platinum version, which gets the same engine, slightly detuned, and some of the more luxurious touches on the inside. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section below. I have to say that there are a lot of really good reasons to buy the Volvo, and I think that this particular model speaks to me a little bit more. I like it more, in a way, than I like the Explorer. But again, if my own money were on the line, I would probably buy the slightly less expensive option. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. And of course, check out our videos on the 2020 XC90 and the 2020 Ford Explorer ST. I'll see you next week. I want to give a quick shout out to the Automotive Video Association. Alex on Autos, along with Redline Reviews, TFL Car, TFL Truck, Engineering Explained, and Matt Moran Motoring were all founding members of this association. And without this particular group, we wouldn't be able to have access to the cars we've had access to this weekend up here in Washington, and we wouldn't be able to get cars like this back to back or together for combined videos. So be sure to check out those other channels and see their takes on the same vehicles that we've been able to drive this weekend.